So before we begin our tour of the diversity of life on our planet, let's take a second to contemplate, where did this life come from? And maybe how did all of this life form? Okay, so one thing that I want to emphasize here is that we don't have a time machine. We can't go back and watch this happening, but there have been several hypotheses as to how life came about, and we can test them in labs today, and some of those experiments that give us information about maybe what early Earth was like and how early life could have formed, have come up with some really interesting results. So that's what we're going to talk about. So know that this is all still kind of a big, we think it happened this way kind of idea, but we have some really interesting experiments that give us clues into how this could have come about. So where did we come from? Where did life come from, right? So those are kind of big existential crises. Let's kind of put this to scale, right? So Earth formed around 4.6, 4.5 billion years ago. Okay, it's this giant kind of rock, molten lava type stuff. It was being pelted with asteroids for the first 500 million years of its life. As kind of our solar system and our galaxy was forming and kind of coalescing. So first, half a billion years of Earth's life, not really conducive for organic life, right? All that kind of settled down around, we think, about 4 billion years ago. Earth really kind of stopped getting pelted by so many asteroids. There was a little bit less disruption. Things cooled down a little bit on the planet. Water started to condense, and right around 4.4 billion years ago, we think that would have been a good time for life to start to come about. We don't really know what happened. Again, what exactly happened is not super clear, but we have some fossil evidence of life that we think dates back to anywhere from 3.8 to 3.5 billion years ago. So we don't think it took very long in a geological timescale for life to come about after early Earth kind of settled down and kind of got out of its weird tween years, right? So these early fossils that we have, they're not of actual living organisms. They are of the chemical components of living organisms, and then we can infer that life would have had to exist if those chemical components were there. And we found these in some really, really old rocks that have survived for the last 3.8 billion years. Okay, so what would have had to happen in order to form the first cell, right? All living things on our planet are made out of cells. So how do we get to that first cell? What are the key steps that are needed to make that first cell? Because if you think about it, a cell is really just a sac made out of organic molecules, a bubble made out of organic molecules filled with genetic stuff, and all the trimmings and trappings necessary to keep that genetic stuff going to the next generation. So again, we don't totally know exactly how this happened, but we have some excellent experiments that give us a framework for how it could have happened. But we do know that there are at least these 4 key steps that are necessary to keep life, or to make life on our planet, right? First, we need to have the formation of organic monomers. So organic monomers, those are those building blocks of life, right? So the pieces that make up the larger molecules in life. So amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Nucleotides are the building blocks of DNA and RNA, right? The A, T, C's, and G's, those are the nucleotides. So those organic monomers would have had to form on their own without life present. Okay, we know that cells can construct monomers and cells can rearrange molecules, but prior to cells existing, these organic monomers would have had to form on their own from non-living components. Then they would have had to assemble into polymers. They would have had to self-assemble into longer strings of those monomers. So a polymer is just many monomers connected together. So many amino acids connected together to make a protein. That's kind of the progenitor of a polymer, if you would. And these organic polymers, this is where our 4 main organic molecules would have come from, right? Carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. Most of these are formed out of monomers connected together to make polymers. So again, this would have had to happen before cells existed, before life existed. is that self-assembly of organic monomers into polymers. Okay, this next step is a little kind of hard to kind of wrap our brains around sometimes, but how do we get the first cell? So a lot of things on our planet in the history of life are sometimes just random chance. Something being in the right place at the right time, and it exists. So this idea of a protocell is the idea that we would have had to have some sort of membrane just happen to form around some of these organic polymers and kind of capture them into that inside that membrane. So this definitely is not totally unrealistic, because the molecules that make up the cell membranes tend to form, when they're in an aqueous solution, they tend to form that membrane structure. Okay, because they have one end that's afraid of water, one end that is water loving, and so they tend to kind of already make that membrane shape on their own, right? So they would have just had to make that membrane shape around some of the early components of these organic polymers. Cell membranes have a hydrophobic end, which is a fatty tail, and a hydrophilic end, which is a phosphate head, and they will naturally form these layered structures with their hydrophobic tails clumping together and hiding from water, and the hydrophilic heads facing out and interacting with water. And that's kind of what we call a protocell, is this idea that membrane would have formed around some of those organic polymers, and then the conditions inside of that membrane would have been different than the external conditions. So we have organic polymers inside of a membrane. Then there had to have come about some sort of self-replicating molecule, right? One of the key components of life is that it has to be able to reproduce. Somehow, some self-replicating molecules, probably replicating molecules that contain genetic information of some sort, would have had to form. Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to dive into, is some of these conditions on Earth and kind of how some of these steps we think would have happened. So some of the early experiments that were done in this space of trying to figure out how life came to be on our planet kind of happened in the early 50s, very similar time frame, if you would, as to when DNA was being investigated and the structure of DNA molecule was being figured out. But one of the kind of the groundbreaking scientists in this group were Urey and Miller. And so at the time, they thought that Earth's atmosphere was reducing, meaning it was an atmosphere that donated electrons to other molecules. So it gave up electrons from the atmosphere and could give the electrons to other molecules. We now know that Earth's early atmosphere was likely neutral, but there were still locations on the planet, like deep sea hydrothermal vents or maybe around volcanoes, where the atmosphere would have been reducing. Okay, so this isn't a completely discounted hypothesis here. It's just that we think that not the entire atmosphere was reducing, but there were pockets of Earth that would have been reducing. What we have here, and kind of what we're looking at, is an experiment in which they tried to recreate that early atmosphere of Earth. So what they did is they kind of recreated the water cycle of Earth at that time. So here we have water that's being heated, so that way it'll evaporate, and then it comes into the atmosphere, right? And so once it kind of moves through this tube right here, water vapor is moved into the atmosphere. The atmosphere that they created in this experimental setup was just methane, CH4, ammonia, and hydrogen gas. There's no carbon dioxide, there's no oxygen gas, just methane, ammonia, and hydrogen gas, which is very similar to what a lot of scientists at the time thought would have been the main components of Earth's atmosphere around 4 billion years ago. There would have been some input of energy of some sort. We think that Earth's early atmosphere had a ton of thunder and lightning storms. So this is what the electrical spark is indicating, some sort of input of energy. Okay, so they kind of made a tiny little lightning storm inside of their apparatus. They then let the atmosphere cool, right? So basically they made it rain by condensing some of that water after it had combined with the methane and the ammonia and the hydrogen gas and was given a little jolt of energy. And then they kind of trapped it again into like this like freshwater pond, you could think that this is trying to emulate. Then some of it would have moved back through, would have been heated up, and then the water cycle would have continued. Okay. So they were trying to basically recreate Earth's early atmosphere and the conditions on early Earth in the lab, which is pretty dang cool if you think about it. And what's even cooler, what's even more mind-boggling that they found is that when they studied this water, they found organic monomers. They found the early components of amino acids. They found the components of proteins. They found the monomers of proteins. They found amino acids. There's nothing living in here. It's completely sterile. All we have is water, methane, nitrogen. All we have is water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen gas, and a little bit of energy. And those molecules will self-assemble. So this is huge because this is evidence that organic compounds can spontaneously generate, they can spontaneously form in the conditions of early Earth. Okay, so that's our first piece of evidence. Monomers can form, right? So that's our first step. Our second step is now we need to form polymers. Okay, so we have these monomers, we have these building blocks. How do we get them to connect together to form these complex polymers, like proteins that living organisms use, right? So there's a couple big experiments here, but the key idea is that, yes, polymers can form spontaneously without living organisms there to direct their formation. So there's a couple experiments, one where they dropped amino acids onto basically some hot clay, and that those amino acids self-assembled into protein-like structures, very simple polymers, not quite as complex as this protein right here, but they were able to form polymers with no life around, right? With no other enzymes and no DNA, these amino acids were able to self-assemble into polymers. And then a related experiment took RNA nucleotides, and same thing. They found that RNA nucleotides in the right conditions can form polymers, right? So take the letters of RNA, they can form strands of RNA, which is huge. So that's our second piece of evidence, is that, yeah, we have these monomers now that can form. Can they form polymers? Yes, they can. Okay, so now our next piece, we gotta have all of those good organic polymers they all gotta be encased inside of a cell, right? So how does that form? How do we get this protocell? So imagine we're in early Earth, we're somewhere where there's a lot of these organic polymers around and a lot of organic monomers are spontaneously forming. Some of these organic monomers also would have been here too. This is the phospholipid molecule. Okay, these would naturally, spontaneously form, just like other organic monomers. But what's different about these is that when these molecules form in water, they will spontaneously form what we call these micelles. So these portions of the molecule are hydrophobic, they're very fatty, they're kind of like oil, right? Oil doesn't mix with water. And these forms of the molecule are hydrophilic. They like water. They will readily interact with water. And so they will naturally form these kind of micelles or these layers, these double layered structures in water. So if that forms, just happens to form around a bunch of organic polymers, boom, there we go. Got some organic polymers contained inside of a cell, a protocell if you would. Okay. A lot kind of had to be in the right place at the right time in order for this to happen, but again, it took a lot of time, right? This would have happened over millions and billions of years. So life has to replicate, right? Life has to reproduce. So the next big question is, how does life make more life? What organic polymer would have served as the kind of original blueprint for making copies of itself? So we have three major components. We could have DNA, that was the original organic polymer that could make copies of itself, so that way that protocell could send on more of that information. We have RNA, right? RNA now functions as kind of a go-between between DNA and protein, right? So all life contains these three basic components. All life contains DNA, RNA, and protein. I mean, even up to 70 years ago, biologists thought that protein was the genetic code of life, right? It wasn't until we figured out chromosomes and DNA that DNA was the genetic code, right? But in early life, we needed a polymer that can not only self-assemble, but also act as an enzyme and self-replicate, okay? The only one of these molecules that fits those three components is RNA. RNA has enzymatic-like properties. It can act like an enzyme, okay? Ribosomes are mostly made of RNA. If you don't know what that is, that's okay. We haven't talked about those yet, but ribosomes are the organelle that builds proteins. And RNA can self-replicate as well, okay? So RNA can build more RNA. RNA can serve as a template for building more RNA. So this is kind of where the idea of like an RNA world comes from. We think that the early forms of life would have used RNA as their genetic material. Later on, DNA would have come into play because DNA is more stable, it's longer lasting. It's just a more stable way to hold genetic information. But we really think it was RNA that was the first genetic molecule because DNA cannot self-replicate. Okay, DNA needs help to self-replicate, but RNA can. Okay, RNA can self-replicate and it can act like an enzyme. It can catalyze processes. DNA can't do that, right? Proteins can't do that either. Proteins cannot self-replicate. They can catalyze chemical reactions, but proteins cannot make more of themselves. Okay, so RNA, we think, was the original genetic molecule of life. So that kind of brings us full circle. How did early life come about, right? We saw that organic monomers can form in the right conditions with the Urey-Miller experiment. We saw that some of those monomers in the right conditions could also form polymers, right? We saw that amino acids and RNA can self-assemble into polymers, long strands of those molecules. Protocells could form. That's not completely out of the question, right? We get those phospholipid bilayers that spontaneously form, and they could just happen to form right around some organic polymers. And self-replicating molecules can form as well. We know that RNA can self-replicate, and we know that it can also have enzymatic properties. So there we go. We have all the key components for forming some of the earliest cells. Way long ago, but these are some of our really early ancestors that gave rise to the rest of the diversity of life on our planet.